Right.
Oh, all right.
So I'm going to talk about the reconstruction that we've done for the ship that was built in 1607, the Pinnace, Virginia. But I want us to start by talking a bit about how I got here. I spent my childhood summers in East Falmouth, learning to row and to sail in the Dyer Dink and to race in sailfish. These are sunfish. Couldn't find
Yacht Club, I think.
60 years ago, and someone is still talking, so we could ask if they would mute themselves.
Yes.
And then Flying Scott. Go ahead. Flying Scots in the Knot in Falmouth Harbor. And then in 1964, Dottie Crossley, a professional photographer who lived in Princeton, hired me to teach sailing at the Woods Hole Yacht Club and to crew for her in the Sunday morning knockabout races in Killarney. Those are shown in two undated photos on the right. Sadly, Dottie passed away in 2019, but much of her photographic work is housed in your museum at Woods Hole, and I thank you for that. Let's see. Yeah, that was supposed to be the other way reversed, but that's all right. No, let's talk about that. I think that's worth talking about. I was going to make the point that few of us get geological, sailors don't get geological representation. Think of Mount Rushmore or something like that. But Dottie's Rock exists out there in Woods Hole. What you're looking at is the passage out from Woods Hole, in which you see in the lower left a green can number 9. And then up just under the sign, you see red can number 2. And so if you're going south into Martha's Vineyard, that's fine. You keep green on your starboard. But if you want to go through the strait into Buzzards Bay, you've got to round that can. And there is a rock somewhere near on that line, as shown down there. And so Dottie is well known in local lore. And as I said, she's not with us anymore, but she's with us in spirit. So now I've got to go back to get this one. Here we go. So in 1967, I came back to Woods Hole as a graduate student under Jim Case to work as his assistant in the MDL's venerable invertebrate zoology course. As the new course director, Jim was updating an offering that had remained much the same since it began in 1888. The course was based on field trips out to collect samples of animals and plant life from the ecological habitats that are around Woods Hole. The specimen would be brought back into the lab and be identified. Case collapsed the 8 weeks into 2 weeks, the first 2 weeks of the course, and then he worked the rest of the 6 weeks into a comparative physiology course that he called experimental invertebrate zoology. We understand that there were some old timers that grumbled a bit about the young upstarts coming in and changing this course that hadn't been altered in those many years. But the young scientists who came to MBL were interested in looking at leading edge laboratory techniques for neurophysiology and respiratory physiology and biochemistry and cellular metabolism and all of these new fields in the 60s. And that course spawned some much needed expansion and renewal in other scientific areas as well. I continued to come to MBL for several more summers during my postdoctoral and early faculty years. But tonight we're going to talk about two ships in this story of mine. They were both built in mid-coast Maine and both named Virginia. Now, some of you may not be familiar with this area. So this map, some of people who think perhaps the Kennebec is simply a mispronunciation of the Kennebunk, this map will show you Cape Cod to the Bay of Fundy, and the ships that we're talking about were built within that red area. And here is that red area expanded. The first Virginia was built down at the mouth of the Kennebec River by members of a short-lived English colony that was founded there in 1607. I've circled Atkins Bay, where the original ship was built. Our ship, the reconstruction, was built in Bath, about 12 miles up the river. Now, the short version of the Popham colony is that in August of 1607, two ships from Plymouth, England, landed about 100 men and boys at the mouth of the Kennebec River. They cleared land, built defenses and dwellings, and built a chapel and built storerooms for all the goods and material that they brought with them. They sought out and traded with the Wabanaki people, the native people at the land at the time. The settlers called their site Fort St. George, but it became known as the Popham Colony because their primary investor was Sir John Popham, the Lord Chief Justice of England at the time. This is a speculative drawing by Sam Manning of what Fort St. George might have looked like some months after the Englishmen arrived. Now, we don't have time tonight to review European politics in the latter half of the 16th century in any detail. Suffice it to say that much of that involved active and proxy wars between Elizabeth I of England and Philip II of Spain. These events included England's defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, which is only some 20 years before the time that we're going to be discussing tonight. And we can follow up on that in the Q&A if there's any interest. So Philip died in 1598, Elizabeth died in 1603, and just a year later, just 1 year after he was enthroned, James I signed the Treaty of London with Spain. There were several provisions to this treaty, but the most important ones were that English privateers would stop attacking Spain's treasure ships that were returning each year from Central and South America, and in turn, Spain would stop trying to convert England back to Catholicism. The effect of this treaty was that the Atlantic Ocean again became safe for merchant shipping, and commercial interests were quick to take advantage of that opportunity. By English law, the king owned all the lands that England had so far claimed in what they called the New World, and James wanted to protect those claims from encroachment by the south, from the south by the Spanish, and from the north by the French. You only protect land by standing on it. In the spring of
The result was that in the spring of 1606, James granted a land use charter to the Virginia Company to establish permanent settlements in this new world.
Guess I had a narration going.
The company established two separate investment structures, one based in London and the other in Plymouth. Investors could support one or both of these ventures, and both immediately began planning their expeditions. The company that was based in London would found the South Colony in the area that became Virginia and North Carolina. The company based in Plymouth would found the North Colony in land we now call New England. There was to be a neutral middle ground centered around what is now New York that was to go to whichever settlement proved strong enough to claim it.
That was interesting. I didn't intend that to be broadcast, but it certainly was correct. So let's go back to the Popham Colony. As I mentioned, it only lasted 14 months. We can discuss why a bit later if there's time and interest, but during the 1607-8 year, the colonists built a small maneuverable ship with which to explore the nearby rivers and coastlines. It's shown under construction in the red circle in the lower right of the picture. So when a resupply ship arrived in October of 1608, it brought notice that the colony was to be abandoned. The colonists rigged their newly completed vessel for an open ocean passage, and in company with a much larger resupply ship, they sailed her back to England. Now it's important to note for the discussion that the shipbuilding affected in the Popham Colony was intentional. The investors' remit to the colony's leaders was to explore for and identify natural resources. The investors recruited an accomplished shipwright by the name of Digby. That's the only thing we know about him. They sent over hardware and anchors and sails and lines with which to rig the ship once it was completed. Their goal was to demonstrate the value of the natural resources in North America, and that included lumber, tall pines to make masts, and oak for planking England's expanding naval and merchant ships. The successful effort of the Popham colonists to build and sail a small ship across the Atlantic has long been overshadowed by their unsuccessful effort to build a permanent English settlement at their worksite. Instead, that honor went to Jamestown, whose colonists were part of the same investment company and had landed and had begun their colonization effort only 3 months earlier in the same year, some 700 miles to the south. Jamestown survived, largely because they recognized that tobacco could be grown in the soil and they had a marketable product. And Jamestown became the first permanent English settlement in North America. But the ship the Popham colonists built in that year while they lived in the Kennebec River began the 400-year-long history of shipbuilding that we have in Maine. Now, that's a lot of new information to take in at one time, even for history junkies. So I want to relax a little bit, and we're going to watch a short video, 4 minutes or so, made by a local TV channel last summer during a harbor festival in Booth Bay, a short distance down from Popham Beach. I can make this work.
More than 4 centuries after her namesake sailed these same waters, the Virginia is making herself known in Mid-Coast Maine, a venture that's been about 25 years in the making.
It's a great amount of satisfaction. It's so many hours and sweat and blood went into this boat, not just from me, but from this whole cadre of dedicated volunteers.
For those who haven't followed the saga of the Virginia, this volunteer-built vessel is a replica of a ship of the same name built on this same river by the short-lived Popham colony from England more than 400 years ago. It was the first English-built ship in the New World, and that's why this project that built the new Virginia is called Maine's first ship.
Anchorson, the Virginia.
Last summer, after more than 2 decades of research, planning, and fundraising, to say nothing of all that hands-on work by volunteers, Virginia was launched into the Kennebec. And a year later, she is rigged and ready. Crews are being trained, and Maine's first ship is sailing.
This is the reward at the end. Going sailing was really my motivation for getting involved in the first place, frankly.
Jeremy Blakelock has been part of the project for 10 years. He's now president of the board and learning to be a crew member.
It was exhilarating. I was a little anxious, of course, because it's a new thing for me, being part of a big crew like this.
In June, Virginia sailed from Bath to Booth Bay Harbor for Windjammer Days, the first real public appearance and the first big test of how this recreation of a historic ship actually sails.
The riggers, no one knew. For a quarter century, it's been theoretical.
Kirsty Trulock is executive director of Maine's first ship. She says no one in New England has sailed a vessel like this for a few hundred years. So they brought in veteran schooner captains and others to help figure it out.
And so they were pleasantly surprised how she sailed.
Also very happy, she says, with how much the crowd liked this sample of Maine history.
And I had people all around me going, just oohing and eyeing, what is that ship? Because all of those beautiful schooners are sleek and lovely, and they have these white sails that are, they sort of blend into the fog. And then here comes Virginia with her tan bark sails through the fog, and people were just going crazy for her. Every child was like, it's a pirate ship!
No pirates, but explorers. The original Virginia and the Popham colony did not stay long in Maine. The little ship, known as a pinnace, then sailed to England and to the Jamestown colony. And so our Virginia will be used to help 21st century school kids and adults understand that 17th century history.
It was always to be able to put students on board and to teach them their history with this very, place-based history lesson, and also just to introduce them to sailing ships in this city of ships.
Because Virginia's other job, maybe a surprise to her builders, is being a tourist attraction in Bath. And that is already happening.
This is a very nice attraction, brings people in the door, it gets them exposed to the history and the story of not just the Popham colony, but of shipbuilding on the Kennebec in general.
Kirsty says on that trip to Booth Bay, people asked where the ship was from.
And then I turned and I said, well, she hails from Bath. And she said, Bath? She said, we just always drive through right over the bridge. We never stop. She's like, now we're going to have to come down. And that's what we want to be that. We want to be that for the city. We want to be able to go out to a few places and be good ambassadors so that people recognize that the city of ships is still very vibrant.
Some of that may have to wait. Virginia can't take passengers yet because she's still waiting for certification from the Coast Guard. We couldn't even step on board at the dock. It means only the volunteer crew members can walk the deck for now. literally learning the ropes.
Nope, alright. Breeze off.
Passengers may have to wait till next year. But for those who do go on board, there are times, moments when the engine is off, when the sails are up and they're at sea, that they get a taste, a feel for what Virginia is all about.
When we
All right, so I'm going to go on to the next step. So what connects those two stories? This 400-year-old settlement attempt and a brand new diesel-powered reconstruction of a 16th century English workboat. This woman does. This is Jane Stevens, who lived in Pittsburgh. For years, she'd heard locals tell stories about English colonists who had come to Atkins Bay several years before the Pilgrims came to Plymouth. In 1994, Miss Stevens contacted Jeffrey Brain, an archaeologist with the Peabody Institute in Salem, and invited him to dig in her property. That's Dr. Brain there holding the stadia rod in her side yard. As it turned out, half of her house was in the footprint of Fort St. George. Working with volunteers and school children and dedicated supervisors during the summers between 1994 and 2013, Dr. Brain excavated her available property. The excavations unearthed several 17th century European artifacts. On the left is a rusted caulking iron. That's a definitive shipbuilding tool. They found a broadaxe and a datable English shilling and more. These artifacts are on display in the Maine State Museum, and we have pictures and replicas of them in our own Jane Stevens Exhibit Center in the Bath Freight Shed. These findings confirmed the written words of the short-lived early 17th century English settlement on the site. The Popham Colony and their shipbuilding project is now included in the elementary and high school curricula here in Maine. Jeffrey Brain's excavations convinced Miss Stevens and her neighbors to start the Virginia Project, which was the original name of Maine's first ship. Their intent was to research, design, construct, and operate as historically accurate a 17th century ship as could be built today, but also receive approval from the Coast Guard. They hoped to build the ship in time for the 400th anniversary of the Popham Colony, 2008. Well, we clearly missed that deadline. This second Virginia took 11 years to construct, except for certain safety-related tasks, such as caulking, admit somebody else here, caulking and engine installation. The construction was done by volunteers, most of whom had no experience on woodworking projects of this size and complexity. So there's little documentation for any ship constructed 400 years ago. Ship design then was valuable intellectual property, and like nautical charts or productive fishing grounds, shipbuilding techniques were carefully guarded secrets. In letters that the colony leaders wrote back to King James, the ship under construction was called a pinnace. John Bradford, a Maine historian, described a pinnace as you see quoted there: relatively fast, lightly constructed, shallow draft support, fishing, hard of carrying, distinctive square flat transom. They were open deck workboats, common on the English rivers and coastal waterways, and a modern comparison would be the panel truck that your plumber drives up to your house when he comes to unclog your drains. In this mid-17th century engraving of ships on the Thames, I've circled a pinnace, and there are two others in there that you can pick out for yourself. So the working design for our Virginia resulted from a decade of library work and collaboration between early MFS board members and nautical historians in this country and in England. They researched descriptions and drawings, both here in the US and the National Maritime Museum in London, to develop the design shown here. A complete set of working blueprints was then drawn by David Wyman, a naval architect and professor of marine engineering at the Maine Maritime Academy. Now, to familiarize you with wooden ship constructions, here's a line drawing of the previous slide, but without the rigging. The major hull components are transom, planking, frames, and clamps. Clamps are on the inside. The deck, the stem, the keelson, which is also inside, the keel, and the rudder. This particular audience has a number of sailors and historical folks in it. You may understand this already, but I'm going to go through it. If I use unfamiliar terminology for anyone in the next few slides, don't worry about it. It's just keep in mind that the overall picture is that the large ship is being assembled from many small pieces of wood. So by 2010, the Virginia project had raised enough money to enter into a lease agreement for the property between the Bath Freight Shed and the Kennebec River. You begin building a ship by laying its keel. Virginia's keel was made of a 38-foot long piece of white oak, and lifting that up onto the braces there, those base blocks, gave us something to celebrate. That year was 2011. The first component to attach to the keel is the stem. It was assembled from 3 large pieces of 5-inch thick white oak from dimensions specified in the blueprints. Full-scale drawings of the stem are spread out on the floor. Outlines of the stem pieces are transferred to pieces of plywood. The process is called lofting, and it's similar to the techniques used by a seamstress to pattern out a piece of clothing before sewing it together. The plywood patterns are then traced into 5-inch thick pieces of white oak and cut out on a bandsaw. Now here's the stem piece being bolted to the keel, the one that was just cut out. In the background, you can see the end wall of a large hoop tent that we built to protect the ship and volunteers from the Maine weather. You'll see that later on in some other slides. Next, we built the frames. These are the curved ribs that support the hull and give the ship its shape and strength. Frames are made by assembling short pieces of wood called futtocks. These strong pieces of straight-grained wood are then fitted together to follow the designed curve of the frame. Here's a pile of futtocks ready to be assembled into frames. Transverse frames from one side to the other of the ship are built as pairs of half frames, each half frame being a mirror image of the partner. To make a half frame, the futtocks are assembled end to end in 2 layers, and they follow the curve specified in the drawings. As shown in the cartoon at the top, the end of one futtock contacts its longitudinal neighbor near the midpoint of its side neighbor. The longitudinally assembled futtocks can then be held together by wooden pegs called trunnels that are pounded through from the side. The workers in the picture are holding a half frame, which is the opposite half is probably the one there at their feet. You can see the trunnel ends, the small bumps protruding from the half frames. So finally, the 2 half frames would then be mounted in a specified position on the keel. One will become the starboard frame and one partner will become the port frame. The full transverse frame then would be set up on the keel. That's called the midship bend, the first one. The subsequent frames are numbered forward and aft relative to the midship bend. Virginia has 38 frames, there are 38 transverse frames, and 6 pairs of cant frames. These are frames that are canted forward, that are angled forward to support and form the bow. So here's the ship with 7 of the transverse frames in position. As we move farther aft, the shapes of the individual frames change. I just love this reverse curve that we get after a while. It's very pretty. The transverse frames then are bound to the keel by the keelson. This piece of wood, or in our case, 2 pieces of wood, go inside the ship and rest on top of the keel. They'll be notched to fit tightly over the frames. So to make a keelson, you square up 2 large pieces of wood, and then you run them out of the parking lot and down the street to the forward end of the ship. And you use a come-along to haul them in over the bow. In this photo, the aft section of the keelson is already in place. You can see it sort of sticking in there from the bottom of the picture. The 2 pieces will then be joined by a scarf joint at the site shown by the red arrow. Now, I understand that perspective is hard to see in this slide, so here's a side view of the aft piece of the keelson. The men are preparing this scarf joint that will receive the matching joint that's yet to be made on the aft end of the incoming forward section. Those keelson pieces are then turned over. They're notched, they're cut so they'll fit on top of the frames. When they're in place, holes can be drilled for the silicon bronze connecting rods that will bind the keelson pieces to the keel. The connecting rods are pounded home and secured tightly from below. This is Rob Stevens, our shipwright. This is the person who got the vessel built, working with large, unwieldy pieces of wood and an all-volunteer crew with differing skill levels and unpredictable family schedules. Wednesdays and Saturdays, Rob and Virginia made steady progress for over a decade. It's quite a commitment, and we couldn't have done it without him. So meanwhile, at the other end of the ship, the stern post and other supporting pieces are being fitted to the keel. And then the pre-assembled transom piece can be put in place. And when the framing is done, she looks like a wicker basket. Now we need to give that basket both strength and stability. And just so you understand, really, the outer set of wooden frames is the shape of the tent that's covered in plastic that keeps all the rain and snow off. So, stabilizing this. Horizontal stability is provided by two sets of large beams that are fitted inside the ship on both sides. One set consists of 6 rows of beams that are positioned in the bilge area, that's down low. Another set of 6, somewhat smaller beams will be fitted to the shear area. The shear is the term for the upper ends of the frames. Mounting these horizontal pieces presents 2 major difficulties. For the beams, which English call clamps, for them to fit properly, each one has to have its inboard surface in line with its neighbors. Here, a worker uses a long batten to see if the faces of the frames will line up on a smooth curve. And he slides that long batten up and down and left and right, and making corrections as he goes. Either sanding or planing off wood is necessary. That's a hand planer that he's working with there. No, an electric planer that he's working with there. Occasionally having to epoxy on a shim, a thin piece of oak, to raise the surface of a frame at some point. This process is called fairing. The other difficulty posed by the clamps is that many of them need to fit to curved surfaces, and for that to happen, they need to bend. Once a clamp was cut to the correct length and planed to the correct thickness, we could soak it in the river for 3 or 4 days and drag it out and put one end into a long wooden steam box. Now, steam from a rug cleaner, that's that yellow device in the background, would then be directed into the box. After about 4 hours, the board would be pulled out of the steam box and carried into the boat shed, brought inside, and then forced into place using hand clamps and brute strength. You have about 20 minutes for wood of that size before the wood dries, after which it'll retain most of the curve that's been forced into it, so that at a subsequent work session, it can be drilled and attached to the frames. This picture shows the forward end of the ship after both the port and starboard sets of bilge clamps were installed. Shear clamps.
And this picture
So,
shows work on the shear clamps. up at the
another
forward
narration
end.
continuing.
These are the ones that are fitted along the upper edge of the frames. The same procedures, of course, are being done all along the midline and at the aft end of the hull as well.
Okay, so we don't need that. Yes, that's how the shear clamps go in. So now let's move to the outside of the ship. Horizontal members mounted on the outside of the ship are called planks. Their job is to keep the water out. They have the same requirement of fitting closely to their neighbors and following a smooth curve along the length of the ship. Fairing and steaming and mounting are done with the planks just as they were done with the clamps. You can see a hot plank here going in for a lower starboard side of the ship. And in this next slide, let's see if it works. This is a video of the process. We are not an OSHA shipyard.
Man down to real fast, so James got around. You're on the wrong side, yeah. You need more people up there? No.
Okay. Now I got to go to the next one. Next. Oh. Bear with me here. There we go. Okay. So the planks are attached to the frames by trunnels, just as the half frames had been assembled. The trunnels are driven into pre-drilled holes using a 12-pound sledge, and that work is best done by younger men, such as this fellow from the local Navy base in Bath. But sometimes those ponies just aren't around. This picture shows you the curvature that's needed for the planks that get mounted in the bow. We broke a few at the start, I will admit that, until we got the timing right. Now, once the ship was fully planked, it could be caulked, and for the underwater seams, we brought in a professional caulker. I didn't even know that was a profession. First, he forced cotton into the gaps between the planks. Of course, the colonists wouldn't have had cotton, but they would have had some other plant fiber. Then he pounded in oakum. Oakum is a tar-treated hemp product. It was traditionally made by taking old, worn-out rope that the colonists had been using on board ship for years, pulling it all apart, putting it in the long threads that could be inserted there in the seams. And then we painted the seams and sealed them with a putty made of pitch and waxy cement, and the hull was sanded in preparation for bottom paint. The next step was to shape and install deck beams. These 4-inch thick beams are cut to a camber and mortised to the shear clamps and into each other to provide a really strong structure. Here's a view of the deck looking aft, also almost fully planked with white pine. The upper bulwark frames, those are the 3.5 foot sides of the ship that you see, are also of pine, but they are the extension of the frames. They are the upper pieces of the frames. 6 mold poured lead blocks of external ballast, each weighing 3,000 pounds, were placed end to end below the keel. Each one was in turn jacked up by hand, braced, and then drilled from above, down through the keelson, through the frame, through the keel, and finally down through the lead and fastened from below. Here they are, all 6 in place. Virginia carries 7,200 pounds of internal ballast as well, and that gets fitted under the floorboards down next to the keelson. 2 summers ago, we installed a Coast Guard required diesel engine, a brand new 175 horsepower Volvo Penta. It was brought on deck and lowered into position using that spindly hand-operated tripod that you see on the right-hand side there, for which I, for one, had little faith in, but it worked. Several handmade pieces of deck equipment were made. On the left is a windlass to raise the anchor. On the right is a knighthead for the main halyard, which looks remarkably like Rob Stevens. Here are fore and aft views of the hull after it was painted. Notice the red painted propeller shaft there protruding in the right-hand picture. Similarly, here are 2 views of the rudder, on the left while being installed, and on the right after it was painted. And at last, Virginia was ready to launch. On Memorial Day 2022, we removed the plastic cover of the hoop tent she'd lived in for the past 11 years. And over the next 2 days, the wooden frame was carefully dismantled. And then, as you saw in the video, on June 3rd, a local crane company stepped her mainmast. And well, the next day you saw that the morning of June 4th, all 70,000 pounds of her were picked up and gently deposited in the Kennebec River. About 4,000 people attended the ceremony. The process was so slow and deliberate that the Bath Town Band had to play Anchors Aweigh 3 times. And here she sat, comfortably at her wharf, all last summer and fall while we fitted her out with anchors and navigation equipment and fire suppression equipment and installed and tested the diesel engine and began to rig her. Now, Virginia's home port of Bath is not a good place for a ship to winter. Large ice flows sweep downstream, miles from above. The Kennebec from Moosehead Lake is about 140 miles or so. They come sweeping down, grinding along the shoreline as they go. And so on December 18th of last year, about a year ago, just a 1-hour river trial 2 days before, Virginia began her maiden voyage under the Carleton Bridge that's there in Bath, bound for Wiscasset, some 30 miles away. I'm that little orange dot, if you see it in the chase boat. We were following along just in case they might need some help along the way. She passed Cox's Head, which is just above the original settlement site. She went past the Civil War era Fort Popham that you can visit today, and out into the mouth of the Kennebec, where the forces of wind and tide and river flow can combine to make a notoriously squirrely passage, somewhat like Woods Hole. But Virginia is heavy and, as expected, was stable and handled the swells and the currents pretty well. We headed east across the Gulf of Maine, rounded into the Sheepscot River, headed toward Wiscasset. There were no other boats out there that day, and it was cold. About 2 p.m., we arrived at our winter quarters at the Wiscasset Town Wharf. Over the next few weeks, we downrigged Virginia and covered her up until last May. About a year ago, Maine's first ship joined the Tall Ships Association, which has helped us get started as a nonprofit sailing organization. We are both their newest vessel, and we represent, along with Jamestown's Godspeed, their oldest time period. This past June, we invited Eric Speth, captain of the Godspeed, to visit Bath for a few days and advise us on Virginia's rigging and handling. So Jane Stevens passed away in 2008, but this dream of hers lives on. Virginia sailed over 100 miles this past summer to visit ports around the mid-coast. Late in the summer, we received Coast Guard approval to carry 6 paying passengers at a time, plus a crew of 4 and a captain. We had a half dozen sail training trips for our crew, and the public enjoyed 25 dockside tours and sailing trips aboard her. Our land-based educational crew facilitated a summer lecture series and taught 5 maritime skill workshops. We maintain the Jane Stevens Exhibit Center as a display museum, much like the Woods Hole Historical Museum, to promote an appreciation of Maine's maritime heritage and an understanding of the early history of Maine. We have videos, information panels, books, hands-on displays, such as knot tying stands and a chip log, a foot-operated lathe, and a kids' corner with ship models to come in and assemble and redesign. I'm going to pick up the idea about flag signaling that I got from the Woods Hole Historical Museum last time I was down there. We're going to do that. Our docents welcomed over 4,500 guests to the visitor center. Our educational volunteers interacted with about a dozen visiting school and other group tours. They were traveled down to see the original site, the original Popham colony. We hosted community events like 17th century dinners, days for sewing and knitting, period clothing. We have a women's shipbuilding day. We've had that for many years now. We share the space with other community organizations such as the Mid-Coast Youth Center and a local land trust and window dressers to help them meet their missions. We do outreach programs in the local schools and with the Maine Maritime Museum and with the city of Bath, and always looking for the best way to sail and use Virginia. So in summary, Maine's first ship has constructed a sturdy seagoing vessel with a reasonably accurate 17th century hull and rig design that we think will be well suited for her inshore environment in which we plan to use her. We are, however, in a serious transition. For 20 years, our loosely knit group of men and women volunteers have been focusing on building a ship. Now, with the ship in the water and the bulk of the construction completed, we have to learn how to operate it as a nonprofit enterprise. And all that entails fundraising and staffing and scheduling and more intensive fundraising. You can learn more about Virginia by visiting our webpage at www.mfship.org or our Facebook page. And poor Eileen is just being entered now. Thank you.